All right, let's talk about how the endocrine system is controlled and a little more detail about the pituitary gland, which is part of that control, and the integration of the brain, specifically the hypothalamus, with the endocrine system. So the hypothalamus, as you might remember from previous topics on homeostasis, especially for body temperature, that's controlled in the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is kind of a coordinating center for a lot of physical things that the brain controls in the body. And one of the places where that information goes from the hypothalamus is to the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland has two halves, and the posterior pituitary is really part of the brain. It's an extension of the brain. It grows during development as an extension of the hypothalamus. And the anterior pituitary is a gland. It's more like the other glands in the body in terms of its origin. But they kind of sit right next to each other, and they interact. So here's what it looks like. So here's the hypothalamus, and you remember that's part of the brain, so named because it's below the thalamus. Hypo meaning below. And so the posterior pituitary is essentially nervous tissue that's just an extension of the hypothalamus, and the anterior pituitary is an endocrine gland that secretes many different hormones, that many of them are what we call tropic hormones. That means they stimulate the secretion of other hormones from different glands. And we'll talk a little bit about the pineal gland as well, which is another part of the brain that also secretes a hormone that circulates throughout the body. The posterior pituitary secretes two hormones that come from the hypothalamus. The antidiuretic hormone, which is also called vasopressin, which it has a lot of interesting effects. And one of the effects of antidiuretic hormone is to cause the kidneys to take up more water from the kidney tubules, and it increases blood pressure. That's one of the effects. It has other effects as well, some very strange ones. Oxytocin, one of the main functions of oxytocin is regulation of milk secretion by the mammary glands, but also uterine contractions during labor, and it also has effects on emotions. The secretion of oxytocin makes you feel relaxed. So it has a lot of different effects. So ADH, or vasopressin, which I just mentioned here, one of the hormones of the posterior pituitary, which remember is essentially nervous tissue. It's an extension of the hypothalamus. There are neurons that extend from the hypothalamus into the posterior pituitary, and these are the neurosecretory neurons of the hypothalamus. And they are called so because the hormone that they secrete is, even though it's coming from a neuron, the hormone is going into the bloodstream. So remember, it's a hormone if it goes in the bloodstream, and that's how it gets to where it's going. So ADH, or antidiuretic hormone, or vasopressin, it is secreted in response to hyperosmolarity of the tissues. So if the hypothalamus detects, so remember, hyperosmolarity, if you can remember that from the last chapter, that means an increase in concentration of dissolved particles, or you could think of it as getting saltier, like the things dissolved in the interstitial fluid are getting more concentrated because there isn't enough water. There's less water, more stuff dissolved in the water. That's hyperosmolarity. And when that is detected, ADH then triggers the kidney tubules to take up more water, or to release more water back into the tissues, signals the kidney to take up more water from the filtrate, so that the urine becomes more concentrated. So that's one of the functions of ADH. Oxytocin affects a whole bunch of different things, but specifically mammary glands. It causes milk letdown. and also during labor, it triggers uterine contractions. Anterior pituitary hormones, there are many of them. They are triggered to be released by releasing hormones that are secreted by the hypothalamus, which then release hormones. And a whole bunch of these end up as a cascade of multiple hormones, with a releasing hormone coming from the hypothalamus, then another tropic hormone being released by the anterior pituitary, and then that finally going out to the target tissue. Prolactin is one of those. Prolactin releasing hormone is released by the hypothalamus and stimulates the anterior pituitary to secrete prolactin, which is necessary for milk production. Normally, if a woman is not lactating, there would be, or a female mammal, I should say, is not lactating, prolactin levels would be extremely low. So one of the things we have being secreted by the anterior pituitary are tropic hormones. So the tropic hormone means a hormone that stimulates the release of another hormone. And we don't pronounce this tropic. Here's another one of the fun things we have in English is we have words that are spelled exactly the same but sound different and mean different things. And then we also have words that sound the same, mean different things, and are spelled differently. But this is one of those examples. So a tropic hormone stimulates the release of another hormone. Tropic is where it's hot. So they're pronounced a little bit differently. So the anterior pituitary produces a number of these hormones. So the tropic effects only. So in this gray box here are the hormones that that stimulate the secretion of another hormone from another structure. So follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, which we'll talk a lot more about them in the chapter on reproduction. They act on the testes and ovaries. Thyroid stimulating hormone stimulates the thyroid to produce thyroxine. Adrenocorticotropic hormone stimulates the adrenal cortex to produce cortisol and mineralocorticoids as well. And then we have ones that are completely non-tropic, which means that these hormones, as produced by the anterior pituitary, are hormones themselves acting on the target tissues. They're not stimulating the production of another hormone somewhere else. So prolactin acts on the mammary glands, and melanocyte stimulating hormone acts on the melanocytes. So melanocytes are the cells in your skin that are producing pigment. And melanocyte stimulating hormone increases the amount of pigment that each individual melanocyte is going to produce. Growth hormone has both tropic and non-tropic effects. So it can affect other glands, and it also affects tissues directly. It has a wide range of effects on different tissues, which is one of the reasons that scientists are concerned about the recreational use of growth hormone by elderly people who are looking to regain their youth, because it has so many effects on so many tissues. It's hard to predict what the effects of elderly people recreationally increasing their growth hormone is going to do. Might not do anything good. Thyroid hormone is an important hormone. Thyroid hormone helps regulate metabolism. It's one of the things that affects your basal metabolic rate. So if your thyroid hormone is low, one of the side effects will be that your basal metabolic rate will be lower than it should be. You will feel tired all the time. And it also affects growth, and it affects the brain. And thyroid hormone has a lot of effects if it's especially notable in if it's abnormal, if it's abnormally high or if it's abnormally low. Both of those things are not good. With being abnormally low is much more common than being abnormally high, but both can happen. So thyroid hormone is sensed in the hypothalamus, and if it's too low, the hypothalamus will secrete thyrotropin releasing hormone to the anterior pituitary, which causes that then to release thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone will act on the thyroid gland to trigger the release of more thyroid hormone. And negative feedback controls the amount of these things produced. So if you take thyroid hormone as medication, that will negatively feedback on the hypothalamus and on the anterior pituitary and stop the production of both thyrotropic releasing hormone and thyroid stimulating hormone, which might not be the desired effect. So the dosage of exogenous thyroid hormone has to be regulated. And you don't want to take too much because you don't want to inhibit the production of the normal amount of hormone. Okay, so we have a stimulus here triggering the release of thyrotropic releasing hormone into the blood, but it's not going very far. The thyrotropic releasing hormone is only going to the anterior pituitary, but it is in the bloodstream, so it's a hormone. And that's going to trigger the anterior pituitary to produce TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone, which is also called thyrotropin. And you notice we have the root in there again, tropic, thyro for thyroid. So thyrotropin just means stimulating the thyroid. So thyroid stimulating hormone means exactly the same thing. So that's going to go to the thyroid gland, trigger the release of thyroid hormone, which is going to circulate around to the body. There's receptors in tissues all over the body for thyroid hormone. That hormone, though, is going to go back and feed back. I'm going to go back a slide. See this little negative here? Negative. That's a negative feedback on both the hypothalamus and on the anterior pituitary. And that's part of the homeostatic mechanism to maintain the correct amount of thyroid hormone, which for most people does work. Because you don't want to have too much thyroid hormone, because then you will be hyperactive and unable to sleep and lose weight. And if it's too low, then you'll be tired all the time and have trouble with tissue repair and growth. So the correct amount of thyroid hormone is very important. It's a common problem to be low on thyroid hormone, and one of the reasons why someone might not be able to produce enough thyroid hormone is if they don't have enough iodine in their diet. Iodine is an essential mineral. We need it in our diet, and there's one reason why we need iodine. We need it to make thyroid hormone. It has iodine in it, and the thyroid, if it doesn't have enough iodine, and TSH is being released and saying, make more thyroid hormone. So the hypothalamus is sensing that thyroid hormone is too low. So the amount of TSH in the blood keeps going up. And this actually causes the thyroid gland to hypertrophy. Hyper meaning high, and trophic meaning trophy or growth. So hypertrophy is overgrowth. So that's what a goiter is. It's the thyroid gland enlarging, trying to make thyroid hormone in response to TSH and being unable to because there isn't enough iodine in the diet. The best natural source of iodine in your diet is any kind of seafood. Anything from the sea is going to have iodine in it. The further away you get from the ocean, the less iodine is found naturally in the soil, which is one of the reasons why right here in the Midwest, goiters used to be really common. And there are places in the world today where goiters are still really common. And these are places where people don't eat any seafood at all. We now have iodized salt. Iodine is found in any kind of a multivitamin supplement. But if you're giving up iodized salt and using some kind of a natural salt here in the Midwest, if you don't have any seafood in your diet, think about your iodine. You might not be getting enough iodine, and if you aren't, then your body is going to have trouble producing enough thyroid hormone. Lots of people are giving up iodized salt in favor. That's why they put iodine in the salt, to prevent goiter. If you're giving up iodized salt and switching to some kind of natural sea salt or something, the amount of iodine there is lower than in iodized salt. There's nothing harmful in iodized salt. Having too much iodine, you have to really consume a lot of iodine. If you consume a little bit too much iodine because you're taking an iodine supplement and you're using iodized salt and you're eating a lot of seafood, if you get too much iodine in your diet, it's just secreted out in the kidneys. Okay, growth hormone does what it sounds like. It regulates growth. If you have too much growth hormone during the growing period in childhood, you will grow much taller than would be expected by genetics. This is sometimes the reason why individuals are super tall. Like the tallest man in history was 8 feet 11 inches, and he was actually from Illinois, from Alton, Illinois. Usually super tall. Here he is with the rest of his family as adults, mom and dad over here and siblings. People who are super tall like this generally have a much shorter lifespan, sometimes only living into their 30s before they die of heart failure or something. Not having enough growth hormone is one of the causes of dwarfism as well. And so if there's a child that is suspected to have dwarfism who is much shorter than would be expected and is getting plenty of food to eat, when they're 3 years old or so, they can notice this. They can test them for growth hormone levels. And if their growth hormone levels are low, then they can give them more and have them grow more like what their genetic potential would be. It doesn't always work though, because some people who are super tall and some people who have dwarfism and are very, very short, the problem isn't that they don't have enough growth hormone, it's something else. There's a lot of factors that go into growth. There are many targets in the body of growth hormone, which is one of the reasons why growth hormone is essential as an adult as well. Adults continue to produce growth hormone, and it's essential for maintaining your muscle mass, maintaining bone density. One of the reasons why it's thought that older adults tend to lose muscle mass is because the amount of growth hormone just tends to decrease with age. It starts decreasing when you're about 30, and it just slowly decreases for your entire adult life. So, but supplementing growth hormone to the elderly hasn't really been tested or shown to be beneficial. And a lot of cancer cells also have receptors for growth hormone, so it might not be a good idea. The amount of calcium in our blood is very important. Calcium is very important for nerve transmission. It's important for muscle contraction, including contraction of the heart muscle. So maintaining the correct amount of calcium ion in the blood is super critical. And our bones serve as a reservoir of spare calcium. So if you don't have enough calcium in your blood, that's more important at the moment than how much calcium is in your bones. So there are two hormones that regulate where calcium is going, if calcium is being taken out of the bones or if calcium is going into the bones. And there are the two glands that regulate it are actually really close together. Embedded within the thyroid gland are these little parathyroid glands that are very small. They produce a hormone, parathyroid hormone, that triggers the bones to release calcium if calcium levels in the blood are too low. So parathyroid hormone increases the level of blood calcium by triggering it to be released from the bones, and it also triggers kidney tubules to reabsorb more calcium. So if you have excess calcium in the blood, it's opposite's going to happen. It's going to be more. It's not going to be reabsorbed from the filtrate and be urinated out. Calcitonin does the opposite, and calcitonin is not released by its own gland, but from specific cells within the thyroid gland release calcitonin, and it does the opposite. So if calcium levels in the blood are too high, calcitonin is released and it increases calcium deposition in the bones and also increases the secretion of calcium by the tubules into the filtrate in the kidneys. So here we have just parathyroid hormone. So Normal blood calcium, if the levels fall lower because cells are taking up calcium out of the blood and using it. Parathyroid. So blood calcium levels fall. Parathyroid glands release parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone stimulates calcium to be released from the bones and also stimulates the tubules in the kidneys to take up more calcium from the filtrate. And it also increases the absorption of vitamin D, which vitamin D should really be considered a hormone. It's not, it's in the steroid hormone group. It's just kind of a weird one in that we can get it in our diet, but we also can make it in our skin if we get enough sunlight, which most of us in the modern world don't get anywhere near enough sunlight to make enough vitamin D. But we could if we were living outdoors like hunter-gatherers. The adrenal hormones are really important. There's two parts to the adrenal glands. So the adrenal glands sit on top of the kidneys. The outside is called the adrenal cortex, and the inside is the adrenal medulla. And they secrete. They're triggered differently, and they secrete different hormones. The adrenal medulla makes epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are very similar and related compounds. You may have heard them called adrenaline and noradrenaline. They have similar effects, but on different tissues. So epinephrine affects the heart more than other tissues. Norepinephrine affects other tissues. These hormones are called catecholamines, and that's, they're water-soluble amines. And these are part of the fight or flight response. And we'll talk more about the sympathetic nervous system and the fight or flight response in, I think, 2 chapters from now when we talk about the nervous system. Epinephrine and norepinephrine are triggered to be released in response to stress. And stress is detected by the brain, by our senses. And it triggers 2 different responses, one slow and one fast. Epinephrine and norepinephrine are part of the rapid response, and the sympathetic nervous system triggers them. The adrenal cortex is part of the slower but longer lasting response. So epinephrine can be released in response to stress in seconds. So if you see something scary, within 10 seconds, you're releasing epinephrine in detectable quantities into your bloodstream. So what do? We already talked about the release of glucose from the liver, also the release of fatty acids into the bloodstream, which also can be used for energy, dilation of peripheral blood vessels so that blood flow to the muscles is increased, blood vessels in the heart, in the brain, and the skeletal muscles are enlarged, and blood vessels in the digestive system vasoconstrict, so that sometimes if you have a sudden scary event after you've eaten a large meal, sometimes then you don't feel well because you're having trouble digesting your food because there's enough blood supply going there. So stress is detected in the brain here, and there are 2 different responses. So the first response, the faster response, is the one that we were just talking about. So there are neurons that connect to the adrenal medulla. They trigger the release of epinephrine. This happens in seconds from the stress. So if you see something scary, if you hear something scary, if somebody drops something behind you unexpectedly and you jump, epinephrine is being released. But it's very short-lived as well. So it's very rapid to be released, and it also drops off very quickly. Also within 30 seconds or so, the levels are plummeting. So it's fast up, fast down. That's your epinephrine and norepinephrine. The slower response comes from the release. So the same stressful event that triggered this release, that same stressful event will trigger the release of adrenocorticotropic hormone, which will go to the adrenal cortex and trigger the release of cortisol and other steroid hormones. that are response to stress. Now this is slower because the hormone has to be released from the anterior pituitary, and then it has to go through the body circulation, and then it goes to the adrenal cortex. So this doesn't start to be released for minutes after the stressful event. But this response lasts a lot longer. So if you have something really scary happen to you, it's close to getting bedtime, maybe you're driving home from work and you're almost in a bad car accident. Oh, that was so scary. And then you get home and now you can't sleep. An hour later, you're still, oh, I can't sleep. That's cortisol. That's the slower response of the stress hormones from this slower system. So slower to react, but last longer. The effects can last hours even after the stressful stimulus is gone. So we already talked a little bit about this. So epinephrine and the different target cells. So it has different effects because there are different receptors on different target cells. So the liver cells, which we already talked about, it ends up triggering this protein kinase A, which is involved with glycogen metabolism. So glycogen gets broken down and new glycogen isn't being synthesized in the presence of, if epinephrine is outside in the bloodstream. In smooth muscles of blood vessels in skeletal muscle and smooth muscle in the blood vessels of the intestines, there's an opposite kind of effect. Even though it's the same hormone, it's going to have a different effect in both of these blood vessels because the receptor is different. In one, it's going to cause those blood vessels to dilate, and in the other, it's going to cause those blood vessels to constrict. So, same hormone, epinephrine, in all three examples here, but different receptors. So, and we have alpha receptors and beta receptors here. So let's look at the muscles specifically here. So smooth muscle lining a blood vessel in skeletal muscle. Epinephrine is going to trigger relaxation, which means that blood vessel is going to dilate. That's what you would want, right? In fight or flight response, you want more blood flow going to the muscles. Well, if more blood flow is going to the muscles, we have to decrease the blood flow somewhere else, or else we're going to pass out from low blood pressure. So epinephrine also trigger binding to a different type of receptor in the smooth muscles that line the blood vessels in the intestines. Instead, those smooth muscles contract, decreasing blood supply so that we maintain the correct blood pressure and we don't keel over from all of our blood vessels dilating. So the adrenal cortex now is not epinephrine. This is the slow response, but the long-lasting response. And we do have a cyclical daily release of these hormones as well. Cortisol is released right before you're going to get up in the morning, whatever your body clock thinks is your normal waking time. Cortisol starts to increase in your blood and helps you wake up, and it increases throughout the day, and it decreases at a few hours before you normally go to sleep. And it's very hard to sleep if you have high levels of cortisol in your blood. So various things can trigger a prolonged secretion of cortisol, including things like having low blood sugar. So if you haven't eaten for a couple of days and your blood sugar is getting low, that will raise your cortisol, which is one of the reasons why when people are fasting, they often find that it's difficult to sleep because cortisol is increased to increase the levels of your blood glucose. Decreased blood volume and pressure. So decreased blood volume, that would be like if you had an injury and you're bleeding. Cortisol will be released in response to that lowering of blood pressure and the decrease in blood volume, which is a good thing. All of the reactions that cortisol causes are things you would want to happen if you're wounded. Also, but unfortunately, lack of sleep and also shock, which is a result of injuries, can also trigger cortisol. Which, if you think about when all these traits evolved, if you were having some kind of a lack of sleep as a hunter-gatherer, it probably meant something really bad was happening. And having cortisol released would help you stay awake and not die from being attacked by a nocturnal predator or whatever was keeping you awake. So there's two categories of these corticosteroids that are produced by the adrenal cortex. Glucocorticoids, which are called so because they affect glucose, and mineralocorticoids because those affect mineral and water balance in the body. So here's a little shot here of the adrenal gland. So we have the outside is the cortex and the inside is the medulla. And remember, the medulla again produces epinephrine and norepinephrine, and the cortex is the slower responding gland that's going to produce the glucocorticoids and the mineralocorticoids. So stress response, and these both of these are produced in response to stress. So here's kind of a summary of what all of these do. So here's our fast response again here on the left. This is our neuron-stimulated release of epinephrine. And we talked about a few of these effects already. We're going to get a higher level of glucose. Glucose is going to be dumped into the bloodstream, which if you're about to have a fight or run away, that would be a good thing. We're going to increase the blood pressure, increase breathing rate, increase metabolic rate, change in blood flow patterns away from the digestive system and towards the skeletal muscle. All those things would be good for fight or flight. And remember, these are very short-lived responses. These responses are longer lived. They're slower, but they're longer lived. So let's look at, glucocorticoids are going to stimulate the breakdown of both proteins and fats to convert them into glucose by gluconeogenesis in the liver. So if you have, and remember, these are the longer acting ones. So if you have some long-term stressful thing, like let's say you're escaping imagine you're a hunter-gatherer, you're escaping some kind of a natural disaster, you got to walk for 3 days to get away from it. Well, breaking down proteins and fats for energy is sure going to be helpful in that situation. Mineralocorticoids, we're going to retain sodium ions and water by the kidneys. This is going to increase blood pressure. It's going to increase blood volume and increase blood pressure. Well, what is this for? What good is that? Well, imagine this is a preparation for being wounded. If you're being chased by a leopard and it gets you and you live, well, you're going to be bleeding, and these effects of the mineralocorticoids are going to help you. So all of these have evolved by natural selection because of things that happen to mammals during the course of evolution. So very important effects. Although in modern society, when we have constant just mental stress, we're not running away from lions anymore. Constant secretion of these can be certainly very problematic and detrimental on your health. One of the effects of constant secretion of glucocorticoids is suppression of the immune system. It's even been shown that just having a bad night's sleep and then the next day you get some kind of a vaccination, your immune response to that vaccination, well, you'll only produce about 50% of the antibodies as somebody who had a good night's sleep. So, although very important in the short term, bad in the long term. Long-term stress, not good, as we know now. We're going to talk a lot more about sex hormones in the reproduction chapter. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail of it now, but the sex hormones are testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone. All three hormones are found in both males and females. It's just the amounts of the hormones and the target tissues of those hormones. Testes are the main source of producing androgens, which are mostly testosterone and a few similar molecules to that. Testosterone is responsible for male secondary sex characteristics and also for the production of normal sperm. We'll talk more about that in reproduction. In females, estrogens are more important, although there is small amounts of testosterone, especially estradiol, which is, we talked a little bit about that particular estrogen in relation to stimulating yolk protein production in other vertebrates. But does other things in humans, although our eggs don't have much yolk in them. They do have a little bit. Progesterone is really important for maintaining a pregnancy and maintaining the lining of the uterus. Men have some progesterone too, and it has some interesting functions. We'll talk more about those in the chapter on reproduction. And we'll talk more about the control of the sex hormones, which are the gonadotropins like follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, which are produced in the anterior pituitary. And, of course, all of this is ultimately controlled by the hypothalamus and gonadotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, but we'll talk more in detail about that in the chapter on reproduction. So let's talk briefly about the pineal gland, which was the subject of much debate for several hundred years before its function was known. It's kind of a weird little obvious gland in the brain. It was at times by early anatomists thought to perhaps be the location of the soul and other interesting purported functions, but really now we know what it does. And the pineal gland is mostly responsible for maintaining your circadian rhythm of day and night. It secretes a hormone, melatonin, at night. And without enough melatonin, individuals find it difficult to get to sleep and stay asleep. And the amount of melatonin that the pineal gland produces, again, slowly decreases with age, which is one of the reasons why old people have a very hard time getting a good night's sleep. And then they're tired during the day and they fall asleep all the time during the day because they don't have enough melatonin at night. Children produce bucket loads of melatonin. That's why one of the reasons why children sleep like logs. And as we get older, we have a harder time sleeping like a log, like kids do. So the pineal gland in ancient vertebrates, the pineal gland is very ancient in the vertebrate brain. And originally, it directly detected whether it was day or night because it was not, it was right underneath the skull and it had direct access to light, could detect light very directly. And that's one of the reasons why it is sometimes called the third eye, because like our actual eyes, the pineal gland also in primitive vertebrates, because their brains are so small, it can detect light directly. So if we look at a human brain here, we have this huge cortex here, which is kind of pushed forward and wrapped around the brain. And here's the pineal gland. Well, in reptiles, their cortex is so small that the pineal gland is actually right there under the surface. And in one very primitive reptile, the Tuatara, which we talked about briefly in the vertebrates chapter, they actually have a thin spot in their skull, and the pineal gland receives light directly from the outside, as it does in many fish as well, receives light directly. And that's how it decides whether it's day or night. And so light goes away, release melatonin. Light comes back, it's daytime. And it's blue light that is most effective at detecting daytime. So blue light, and how do our pineal glands detect light? Because our pineal glands are completely in the dark. We have so much brain and skull on top of the pineal gland, it's perpetually in the dark. So it gets its information from your eyes. Your eyes have a direct connection, a direct neuronal connection to the pineal gland, and they give information to the pineal gland on how much blue light is present. So blue light, when light is lacking during the day, this throws off your circadian rhythm and may be one of the reasons for the seasonal affective disorder. That's why they sell those blue lights for people to put on their desk and shine in their face during the day. If you live in Canada or Minnesota or somewhere, or you get depressed in the winter, blue light helps. Why? Because that's what the pineal gland is detecting. It also means that if you're looking at blue light in the evening or at night, especially like from your phone, which these primarily give out blue light, that's going to make it hard for you to sleep. If you're staring at your phone at 10, 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock at night, that blue light is telling your pineal gland it's not nighttime. Don't make melatonin. Don't make it. That's why the red shift on phones has become popular. And studying this in the research lab, it's been found that reading a book with a normal light doesn't do that, nor does watching TV if the screen is far away. But if you're looking at a computer screen or your phone or an iPad, that is triggering your pineal gland to think it's daytime and is lowering your melatonin production. So if you want to sleep better, get rid of all the blue light 2 hours before you want to go to sleep. So if you want to go to sleep at 11 o'clock, that means that you have to stop looking at all computer screens and phones and iPads and laptops 2 hours before that. You can read a book with a real light. You could watch TV as long as the TV screen is, a normal TV distance away and not in your face the way a laptop screen is. Both of those things are okay. Or that's why they sell those blue blocker glasses as well for people who really feel they can't tear themselves away from their email before they want to go to bed. You can buy these blue blocker glasses and you can put those on 2 hours before you go to bed. Having too many LED lights in your house is bad as well. The newer low energy LED bulbs are great for saving electricity. They're so much better than those icky fluorescent lights, but they also have a lot of blue to them. They're very blue, and those are also bad in the evening. So shut your lights off in your house, stop looking at the screens, and increase your melatonin production naturally that way so you can sleep better. So hormones have evolved for different functions. So the hormones that we have do different things in different vertebrates. It was really surprising when it was discovered that hormones like prolactin are found in animals that aren't mammals. And what that means is that prolactin first evolved for other functions in other vertebrates. Like, fish have prolactin. Why? They don't make milk. So that means prolactin evolved to do something else, and then during mammal evolution, it was co-opted for a new function. That happens all the time during evolutionary history. Thyroid hormone in frogs is part of metamorphosis. Thyroid hormone increases during metamorphosis and helps the tail to be reabsorbed and the legs to grow. And that can be shown experimentally. You can disrupt that experimentally. Just like, these frogs here, if you artificially increase the amount of melanocyte stimulating hormone, you haven't changed the number of melanocytes. And this is a black and white picture. These frogs are both kind of greenish, like olive green kind of. But increasing the amount of pigment that each individual melanocyte produces makes a big difference. And melanocyte stimulating hormone has other functions besides just triggering melanocytes to produce pigment. And this is an area that's currently being studied, as anything that has to do with hunger or metabolism has a pretty easy time getting research funding at this time. So we're going to find out a lot more about it. All right, that's the end of hormones and the endocrine system, and I'll see you in class.